I never thought a childish prank would save me and my brother's life. It began in late September. My family cat had passed from old age a few weeks prior. I missed her terribly and assumed the strange things that began to happen were just echoes of my grief. When she was still alive, she used to scratch at my door until I let her into my room. And she used to use the crawl space as her own little home, sometimes hiding away for most of the day until pushing the door open in the middle of the night. I had gotten so used to it that I was no longer startled by the tapping of little paws upstairs and the sound of little doors creeping open. So used to it, in fact, that when those same things happened after her death, it took me a while to notice. When I finally did notice, the sounds gave me a strange feeling of unease but familiarity. I told myself that it was just the creaking of an old house, but a part of me wanted to believe she was still here in some capacity. One night in October, I was awoken by scratching at my door and a faint meow. It lasted only a few seconds, but I heard it clearly. I thought it was a dream. It had to have been. After all, she was gone. But then, it kept happening. Every night at 1:46 a.m., I would hear scratching at my door and the cries of a cat who was long dead. I told no one of it because even though it frightened me, I didn't want to lose what I had left of my dear cat. The scratching stayed the same until the night of October 21st, when it became harder to ignore. Everything was normal that night. My parents had gone out for the night and my brother was sleeping downstairs. I watched YouTube until I fell asleep with the glow of my laptop still on my face. When I heard the scratching, I wasn't even scared. It felt like any other night, until it didn't stop. The scratching only got more frantic, and the crying grew in volume with each swipe of a claw. I had never heard my cat act like this, even when she was alive. I quickly sat up on my bed and checked the time. 1:46 a.m., like always. The scratching got even worse. It sounded like she could tear through the door at any moment. I got up from my bed and slowly cracked open the door. My heart was racing. I had no idea what I would see behind that door, but I had to open it. I opened the door only a crack, and suddenly it pushed open. However, there was nothing behind the door. I felt a strange presence, like something came into the room. I didn't know what else to do but to go back to bed and try to fall asleep. The next few nights were just the same. The scratching was almost deafening until I opened my door to let no one inside. It was creepy but comforting. Every time I opened the door, it was like my cat came to visit me from beyond the grave. The last night I felt her presence was a night I will never forget. To this day, it was the most horrifying night of my life. It was Halloween night. I had just come home early from a party so I could stay with my brother for the night as my parents were out of town. We watched and made fun of Halloween movies from our childhood until midnight. I thought it would be funny to scare him with the scratching and meowing, so I told him to sleep in my room that night. I never thought a childish prank would save me and my brother's life. I got in my bed and he got in a sleeping bag beside me. He fell asleep almost immediately while I could barely keep still from the anticipation. Suddenly my window flooded with light. I assumed it was my parents coming back early from their trip, but something felt off. The clock struck 1:46 a.m. Instead of scratching or meowing, the little door to the crawl space flung open. A dark figure rushed out and jumped right at me. I let out a scream, waking my brother beside me. The dark figure went through my chest and disappeared behind me. I was left hyperventilating and holding my hand to my chest. This wasn't a visit, it was a warning. I heard what sounded like someone trying to get inside the house, and without hesitation, I grabbed my brother and told him to go into the crawl space. He was groggy and disoriented, but did what I said. I followed behind him and moved a chair in front of the little door before closing it. I told him to be completely silent. We heard a big crash and then footsteps downstairs. Someone had broken through the window. I heard the stranger open all the doors and push things over. I felt my face go white as I heard the stranger start to come up the stairs. I held my hand over my brother's mouth and began to pray in my head. The stranger was at the door. My heart was pounding. He flung the door open and entered the room. I could hear him flip my bed over and knock over my nightstand. I thought we were going to die. My brother was silently texting the police while all I could do was stare at the door, knowing it would open at any second. The stranger pushed over the chair in front of the crawl space. The only thing left between me and the intruder was a little door. My brother and I grabbed the handle and held it shut. I then heard the hiss and growl of a cat. It felt like it was right behind us. Finally, the intruder tried to open the door. We held it shut for as long as we could until the stranger flung it open with one great pull. Before I could even get a good look at him, the dark figure leapt out from behind us and pounced on his face. It all happened so quickly, you could only see the flicks of blood flying around. He fell to the ground crying out and holding his now mangled face. The dark figure ran into the shadows and my brother and I ran out the door and down the stairs. We screamed for help out in the cold until the neighbors came outside to see what was wrong. The police arrived a short time after. It turns out the stranger was a drug-addicted ex-convict who was breaking into people's homes around the area looking for cash. They found him screaming in pain, covering his hollowed-out eyes. The police also found a knife beside him that he had taken from our kitchen. My brother and I were standing out in the cold when I saw the faint green glow of my cat's eyes in my bedroom window. That was the last time I ever saw my family cat. Oh shit, I thought, as I walked through the front door and saw the little furry body of my daughter's pet hamster, Cece, lying on the floor in front of me. Cece wasn't the hamster's real name, it was Chubby Cheeks. But Samantha's sister Allison had trouble saying that, so we came up with a nickname just for her. I nudged Cece's body with my shoe just to be sure he was really dead. He was. I was afraid this was going to happen. Our cat, Baal, loved to catch things and leave them for me to find, and his favorite place to leave them was right by the front door. Samantha must have left her bedroom door open when she left for school. I warned her that this would happen. Every time that door was left open, even for a second, Baal would come running from wherever he was and try to sneak into the room. I figured Samantha was going to want to bury the hamster in the backyard, so I went into the garage and found a suitable box to bury him in. Then I used my car key to flip the body into the box. I know I wasn't being delicate, but the hamster was dead. I don't think he minded. As I stood there with the box, I briefly considered throwing it in the trash and telling my daughter that Cece must have escaped. I wanted to spare her the heartache of losing a pet, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized that was a bad idea. Pets die, that was something she was going to have accept. I took the box into the kitchen, where I stuffed it with paper towels to keep the hamster's body from sliding around. When I finished, I walked over to the junk drawer to grab some tape to keep the box closed. That was when I saw the note I had written on the dry erase board. Early release today, the note said. I had underlined it 3 times and I still forgot about it. If today was an early release day, the girls should already be home. I checked the time just to be sure. It was after 2 o'clock. They should have gotten home over an hour ago. Samantha, Allison, I called out as I walked through the house. I called out again when I got to the foot of the stairs. No one answered, but I did hear a soft thump from one of the upstairs rooms. As I walked up the steps, I noticed that Samantha's door was wide open. She had to be home. I could see her backpack sitting on the bed. Once I made it to the top of the stairs, I walked over to Samantha's room and peeked in, but she wasn't in there. I did notice that Cece's cage was sitting sideways on the floor with the top lying a few feet away. I shut her door and continued to call out, wondering where they were. They knew better than to leave the house on their own. When I got to Allison's room, I noticed the door was slightly ajar. I don't know why, but when I grasped the knob, I got the sudden feeling I shouldn't open it. I figured it was an irrational fear, likely caused by my growing concern over where my daughters were. I wasn't going to let that stop me from searching for them, though. I took a deep breath and swung the door open. What I saw made me take a step back and place my hand over my mouth. Sitting on the bed with her knees tucked underneath her was my daughter Allison. She was leaning on her left arm while she licked blood off of the fingertips of her right hand. She licked her fingers the way a cat would lick its fur, with long strokes of her tongue. Around her neck was Baal's collar. When she noticed me, she stopped what she was doing and made a soft mew sound. Then she started purring. It sounded so unnatural coming from her. "Alison," I said as I slowly approached her. She just stared at me and continued to make those unsettling cat noises. That was when I glanced down and noticed the black furry legs poking out from beneath her bed. I squatted down, grabbed the closest one, and slowly slid the body of Baal out into the open. I looked up at Alison and watched as she continued to mimic the movements and sounds of the dead cat, right down to the way she cocked her head inquisitively at me. "Samantha!" I yelled suddenly. That startled Alison. She hissed at me and produced a low growl from deep in her throat. I ran out of the bedroom and shut the door behind me. I rushed frantically from room to room, calling out for Samantha. She wasn't supposed to leave Alison alone, but I couldn't find her anywhere. I was hoping she could tell me what the hell was going on. I searched the entire house until I came to the door of the one place I had yet to check, the basement. "Please be here," I thought as I slowly opened the door. "Samantha," I called out to the darkness, but no one replied. I didn't expect her to. She was afraid of the dark. If she was down there, the lights would be on. I still wanted to check though, just to be sure. I turned the lights on and walked down to steps into the basement. When I reached the bottom, I looked around and called out her name one more time. There was no response. I was about to go back up to the kitchen when the door that led to the backyard swung open and Samantha poked her head into the room. "Mom, is that you? Samantha!" I rushed over and wrapped my arms around her as she walked into the basement. Happy that she was safe, my fear quickly turned to anger as I tried to make sense of what was going on. I pushed Samantha away and held her at arm's length. "What happened to your sister?" I demanded. She started to sob. "I don't know. I was laying on my bed when she crawled in on her hands and knees wearing Baal's collar. When I yelled at her to get out of my room, she attacked me." She showed me the scratches on her arms. "Alison did this." I looked down at long red welts. She nodded. "I tried to force her out, but she was like a wild animal, so I ran over to April's house. I tried to call you, but you didn't answer. I reached for my phone, which I normally kept in my back pocket, but it wasn't there. I must have left it in the car. I did that frequently when I had it connected to the car's USB port. Come on." I grabbed her hand and led her up the basement stairs and into the kitchen. I was going to take her into the bathroom and clean her wounds, but I stopped when I saw Alison sitting on the kitchen counter. "Alison," I held my palm out towards her in a placating gesture. "That's not Alison," Samantha said. "What do you mean?" I asked. "It's Baal." Before I could ask Samantha to explain, Alison leapt off the counter and ran at her sister, hissing and snarling as she closed the distance. I pulled Samantha back into the basement with me and shut the door right as Alison collided with it. I held the door shut as she clawed at the other side, trying to open it. I didn't let go until she gave up and walked away. I turned towards Samantha. "I need to go and get my phone out of the car." "No," she said, while shaking her head. "It's okay, I will only be gone for a few minutes." I reached into my pocket and pulled my car keys out. "Come here and hold the door closed. She won't be able to open it if you're holding it." I figured that would give her a sense of security while I was gone. She reluctantly reached out and grabbed the handle. "I'll be right back," I assured her. It took me less than 3 minutes to run out to my car and retrieve my phone. "Everything's going to be okay," I told her when I returned. "Why don't you go back over to April's and I will come get you in a little while?" She just stood there and stared at me. "Go ahead, Sam. It's okay. Alison isn't going to leave the house." I wasn't positive of that, but I hoped it was true. Once I convinced her to leave, I pulled out my phone and opened my contacts. I scrolled down until I found my husband's number and tapped the screen. I stared at the ceiling, wondering where Alison was, while I waited for my husband to pick up the phone. "This is Father Cook." I didn't recognize the voice that answered. I pulled the phone away from my ear and looked down at it. The number showing on the screen was not my husband's. "I'm sorry," I said. "I must have dialed the wrong number. If you are looking for Pastor Reed, he won't be in today. Perhaps I can be of assistance." That explained what happened. Pastor Reed's number was listed right above my husband's. In my haste to call my husband, I must have accidentally tapped the wrong contact. "I'm sorry," I apologized again. "I really need to get in touch with my husband." I hit the end call button. I didn't want to be rude to the priest, but I didn't have the time to explain. I opened my contacts again and made sure to tap on my husband's number. After several rings, it went to voicemail. I left a message telling him to call me back as soon as possible. Then I hung up and called him again. I tried calling him several times, but I kept getting transferred to his voicemail. I leaned my back against the door in frustration and slid down it until I was sitting on the steps. I didn't know what to do at that point except wait. So that is what I did. When the phone rang a few minutes later, I jumped up and answered it, thinking it was my husband. "I'm sorry to disturb you, Mrs. Duncan, but I couldn't stop thinking about you. I hope you don't mind me calling you back. I just wanted to make sure you were okay. You sounded upset," Father Cook said. "No," I yelled into the phone. "I'm not okay. I have a dead cat and a daughter that no longer thinks she is human, so no, I am not okay." "Maybe you should start at the beginning," he said calmly. "Tell me what happened and don't leave anything out, no matter how crazy or irrelevant you think it might be." I was surprised by his response. He was nothing but polite to me, and I just screamed at him. He seemed like he genuinely cared and wanted to help. Maybe he could help. He was a priest after all, and what I was dealing with seemed a little outside the bounds of reality. I felt bad for yelling at him. I was originally going to have my husband come home and help me catch Allison so we could take her to the nearest hospital. But as I thought about it, maybe that wasn't the best idea. I took a deep breath and told Father Cook everything that happened since I got home. "Stay where you are," he said after I finished telling him what happened and given him the address. "I will be there shortly." He seemed convinced that my phone call wasn't an accident. He believed something had guided my hand and brought the two of us together so we could help Allison. I hoped for my daughter's sake that was true. 20 minutes later, there was a knock on the basement door, the one that led to the backyard. I walked over and opened it. Standing before me was Father Cook. He was dressed exactly as you would expect. When he saw me, he pushed his thick-rimmed glasses up the bridge of his nose and introduced himself with a smile. "Please come in." I stepped to the side. "Where is your daughter now?" He didn't waste any time getting to the point. "I don't know," I shrugged. "Probably upstairs." I followed Father Cook up the basement stairs and into the kitchen. He stopped and listened. I could hear the soft thread of footsteps above us. "Is there anyone else in the house besides your daughter?" he asked. "No." He walked through the house until he came to the staircase. He placed his hand on the banister and started to climb the steps. "Which room is Allison's?" He turned and asked before continuing. I pointed to her door. I waited and watched as he walked into her room. A few moments later, he walked out and continued down the hall. I could no longer see him, but I could hear him. "Hello, Allison," he said. "I'm Father Cook. I'm a friend of your mother." Allison hissed in response and then started to growl. Father Cook backed down the hall slowly. He had his hands out in front of him as he tried to calm Allison down. When he made it back to the stairs, he descended them backwards, keeping his eyes on my daughter. She followed him, hissing and growling the entire time. She didn't stop until she reached the steps. "Let's go," he said, and put his hand on my shoulder to guide me away. I let him lead me into the kitchen, then back down into the basement. "The collar your daughter was wearing, did that belong to the cat?" Father Cook asked me once we were safely behind the closed door of the basement. "Yes, it did," I answered. "Where did you get the cat?" "It was a stray. It just showed up one day and started hanging around the house. The girls started feeding it and letting it into the house, and we just sort of adopted it. It didn't seem like a bad cat." "Was it always wearing that collar?" I nodded. "I need to make a call." He pulled a phone out of the pocket of his jacket. "This is a little outside my area of expertise." "Do you still think you can help her?" "Yes, I think so," he said. then excused himself to go make his call. When he returned, he was smiling. "Help is on the way." While we waited for whoever was coming to help us, Father Cook did his best to ease my fears and reassure me that everything was going to be all right. A short time later, there was a knock on the back door of the basement. Father Cook walked over and answered it. "I'm Father Cook. I'm the one who called." The priest introduced himself and reached out his hand to the tall, thin man who stood before the open door. He looked like he could also be a priest, but he wasn't wearing the white collar. "Father Cook, the exorcist?" the man asked as he clasped the priest's outstretched hand. "I guess my reputation precedes me." The priest seemed uncomfortable. "Theodore Alexander," the man introduced himself. "Magister Alexander." The two men seemed to have heard of each other. I could tell they had a great deal of respect for each other as they talked. "I'm a bit surprised they sent you," Father Cook said to the man he called Magister Alexander. "They didn't send me. I was dealing with another matter when I overheard your call. A priest calling us and asking for help is a rare occurrence. I was intrigued and had to come and see what was so important for myself. I must admit I wasn't expecting to find you here. I was also in town for a separate matter, one you might be able to shed some light on, involving a local pastor." Magister Alexander smiled. "I'm not sure I know what you are talking about." It was obvious to me that he was lying. "We can discuss it later, after we deal with the matter at hand." Father Cook could tell he was lying as well. "Of course," Magister Alexander said, then asked, "Where is the girl now?" "She is upstairs," I blurted out and pointed to the ceiling. "You must be Mrs. Duncan." Magister Alexander walked over and offered me his hand. "It is a pleasure to meet you." "Same," I said, but I wasn't being honest. There was something unsettling about the way the man looked at me. "I'll show you the way," Father Cook offered. I followed the men through the house until they stopped at the bottom of the stairs. Father Cook pointed at my daughter where she was sat at the top of the steps. "She's wearing it on her neck," the priest said. I watched in amazement as Magister Alexander walked up the stairs and placed his hand on Alison's head. To my surprise, she leaned into his touch and started to make that unsettling purring noise. While he was stroking her hair, he used his free hand to reach into his pocket and pull out some sort of pendant. I couldn't make out the design from where I stood. He placed the pendant against her forehead and started to speak in a foreign language. When he finished, Alison's eyes rolled into the back of her head and she slumped to the floor. I gasped and placed my hand over my mouth. I was about to run up the steps, but Father Cook stopped me by placing his hand on my arm. "She's fine," he whispered in my ear. "He knows what he is doing. This way was much safer than having to perform an exorcism." I looked over at the priest, then back up at Magister Alexander. "Why would she need an exorcism? Your daughter was possessed by your cat. How is that even possible?" With this, Magister Alexander had removed the collar and held it out towards us. "It's just a collar, isn't it?" I knew something was seriously wrong with my daughter, but hearing she was possessed by our cat was hard to believe. "This is much more than just a collar," Magister Alexander said as he slid it into his pocket. "It's a simulacrum." "A what?" I had never heard that word before. "It's a possessed item," Father Cook said. "If it is worn, it allows the spirit bound within it to possess the wearer." Before I could ask one of the thousands of questions running through my mind, Magister Alexander bent down and lifted Alison up off the floor. "Which room is hers?" he asked as he stood up. I pointed to her open door, then walked up the stairs and followed behind him. I entered the room as he gently laid her down on the bed. "She will probably sleep for the rest of the night," he said as he stepped out of my way. "Why was the cat wearing that collar?" I asked as he walked out of the room. "I don't know." I didn't believe him. I could tell he knew more than he was saying. I wanted to confront him and demand an answer, but I didn't have the energy. I was too tired after everything I had been through. Instead, I sat on Alison's bed and ran my hands through her hair while she slept. "Why did you lie to her?" Father Cook had come up the stairs and confronted Magister Alexander right outside the bedroom door. Even though he was trying to keep his voice low, I heard him clearly. I got up and quietly made my way to the door so I could hear them better. I did it to protect her family. If she knew that cat once belonged to her grandmother, how do you think she would react? Her mother gave her life to leave the coven. She paid the ultimate price so that her daughter could have a normal life. I am obligated to honor the deal she made. My mother died when I was young, and I never knew my grandparents. What I just heard alarmed me. Was Magister Alexander implying my mother was a witch? If her mother made a deal to leave the coven, why was the cat here? Father Cook asked as they descended the stairs. I was hoping you could help me with that, Magister Alexander responded. This cat shouldn't be here. We shouldn't be here, and yet we are. We were brought together for a reason, and we need to find out why. That was the last thing I heard as the men let themselves out the front door.